different journals such as European Journal of Political Research, Governance, Party Politics, and more of like this. His current research focuses on the emergence of party cartels in advanced democracy and the relationship of partisan politics to income inequality and welfare state change. Discussing the lecture of Professor Hopkin will be Attila Meleg, Dr. Attila Meleg, who is an associate professor at the Corvinus University from Budapest, who is also a senior researcher at the Demographic Research Institute. As you might know, Attila Meleg is a sociologist, economist, and a historian, and he has like a vast teaching experience, having taught in the United States, in Russia, in Georgia, and in Hungary. Besides the comparative historical analysis of international migration and population discourses, he also does research on the role of global hierarchies in Eastern Europe transformation using postcolonial criticism. He is the author of a renowned book on the East-West slope, globalization, nationalism, racism, and discourses of Central and Eastern Europe. He is regarding very related to the theme of this conference. He's the founder and director of Carl Ponanin Research for Global Studies at director and founder of this center from the Corvinus University. My name is Dana Domshodi, and I'm a lecturer in the Department of Sociology, Faculty of Sociology and Social Work here in Cluj-Napoca, and I will be your host today. When it comes to the organization of this event, Dr. Hopkin will start. He will give his lecture, then I will give the floor to Dr. Meleg, and after that I will open the discussion for everybody. So I kindly ask you to remember to hold on with the question until after the discussion of Dr. Meleg, and then as you prefer, although I would prefer if you will just signal me you want to ask a question and then I'll give the floor to you. But if you cannot do that, then it's fine if you write your questions in the chat section, and with your permission, I will read them out loud. I think this is it, as we are pressed for times, and I think we should start. So, Dr. Hopkin, you have the floor, or the virtual floor, so to speak.
Thank you very much, Dana. Thanks to everybody for taking your Saturday morning and using it in this way to listen to me. So I've got some slides up here. I hope you can see them okay. So what I'm going to talk about today is, I guess, a particular kind of interpretation of what is happening to the political economies of the Southern European democracies, and offering an interpretation of the development, the evolution of these political economies using a kind of Polanyian framework. A lot of what I'm going to say is drawn from my recent book, which is Anti-System Politics. This is published by Oxford in 2020. I call it The Crisis of Market Liberalism in Rich Democracies. What I'm trying to explain in this book is why we've seen sort of the rise of various kinds of anti-establishment. Some people call them populist political movements in Europe and in elsewhere, in other rich democratic countries. And in particular, I'm kind of focused in trying to understand how economic problems, economic distress caused this kind of strong political reaction, but how the political reaction that you get varies in different places. So although I talk about Southern Europe, I also talk about the English-speaking world, especially Britain and America. But the broad argument I'm trying to make also is can be extended across the Western countries. And I'm basically trying to understand why it is that you get these kind of counter movements, these political reactions against a particular form of market economy. So although this book talks about Britain and America, it also has chapters on Italy and Spain and a chapter on the Eurozone crisis in general. And that's the part that I'm going to draw on mainly in my talk today. So, as I said, it's a kind of Polanyian interpretation of the debt crisis in Southern Europe. So I'm particularly taken by this really very simple framework that Polanyi draws out in The Great Transformation, in which the advance of market thinking the advance of market sustaining institutions inevitably provokes social stress and political reaction. So what I'm trying to do is in the book, I apply this also to Britain and the United States. I have an article in the British Journal of Politics and International Relations on Brexit. And if, although this is not the subject of the talk, I'm happy to take questions on Brexit afterwards. Obviously, I've spent a lot of time thinking about that while I was doing this book. But I'm particularly focused here on what's happened to monetary union in the European Union, and how it's affected Southern Europe. Part of this is based on a sort of understanding of what makes Southern European political economies distinctive, but also I'm trying to understand why you get distinctive political responses in Southern Europe compared to other parts of the world. So this project, and by the way, although I've come out with this anti-system politics book, and my plan is, and we'll see in a few years' time whether this plan has been realized, is that I would like to develop this this interpretation of Southern European political economy much more in the coming years. So the questions I'm asking in this project are, well, first of all, what is the distinctive way in which capitalism is embedded in Southern Europe, embedded in the kind of Polanyian use of the term? So how does the market economy fit in with other forms of social relations in Southern Europe? Obviously, I'm interested in the euro and the way in which the euro has changed Southern Europe's political economy, because you'll all be familiar with the variety of ways in which membership of the European Monetary Union enables but also constrains the member states, especially the member states such as Southern Europe that find themselves in the economic periphery. And then I'm interested in how societies respond to these processes. So what kind of social and political reaction do you get? So my main argument, I guess, is to simply say Polanyi was right, that you can't push this idea of the self-regulating market very far before the disruption it creates will lead to political reactions, sometimes quite violent ones. Fortunately, the world which Polanyi was writing in is not the world of today. I don't think we can be complacent. There are so many examples of slide towards authoritarianism, aggressive nationalism, but so far, European countries are not fighting each other, although there's a lot of rhetoric, especially in Britain, I have to say, which sounds a bit like that. But within these constraints, clearly pushing the market agenda has led to political instability. And I'm trying to illustrate this really quite simple argument and producing empirical evidence for it. So my inspiration is this phrase from the Great Transformation, that to allow the market mechanism to be the sole director of the fate of human beings and their natural environment would result in the demolition of society. Although you will see that some of the things I have to say about this are quite optimistic, in the sense that I think in many ways, all of our societies, but Southern Europe in a distinctive way, has actually resisted this process, and in part quite successfully. So I'm very taken by, and part of the objective of the Anti-System Politics book was to try and push back against an interpretation of political upheavals that we hear a lot, that it's all about kind of cultural divides, that, the split between cultural progressives and cultural conservatives and so on, that somehow all of this is unrelated to or adjacent to economics. I don't buy that at all. I see many parallels in what happened in Europe in the 1930s. The same kind of attempt to create a self-regulated market that Polanyi describes, which in the European case, of course, is the single European, the European single market, and then the sort of shift to monetary union too, which applies a kind of gold standard logic, which is very well described by Barry Eichengreen's books, forcing very painful adjustments to economic crises, rather than, let's say, a more flexible approach which might limit the social damage of economic crises. The European Union, although now, of course, we have the Recovery Fund, which seems to be a bit of a departure from this agenda, but for the best part of a decade after the financial crisis of 2008, we have this approach to coming out of the crisis based around the concept of austerity. So limiting the ability of governments to protect their citizens from economic distress, very well described by Mark Blyth in his book, Austerity, History of a Dangerous Idea. In Southern Europe, the result of that is wage stagnation for many, unemployment for many, and an increase in poverty for many. But not only is it a question of unemployment and poverty, there is also social upheaval really across the whole of society, as very few groups are able to completely insulate themselves from the effects of this crisis. So obviously, I might be preaching to the converted here, and it's probable that you're all familiar with this argument already. I'm used to presenting this talk to a more Anglo-Saxon audience, which in many ways is less familiar, I think, with Polanyi's work. But just to reiterate Polanyi's idea of the double movement, and I guess the double movement is the organizing framework of my understanding of what's happening to Southern Europe, which is that while on the one hand, markets spread all over the face of the globe, on the other, a network of measures and policies was integrated into powerful institutions designed to check the action of the market relative to labor, land, and money. Of course, in the Southern European case, many such measures and policies existed before entry into the Eurozone, and many have survived entry into the Eurozone. But of course, the persistence of some of these policies has created a great tension with the needs to respond to financial pressures. So a lot of the politics that we've witnessed, and Spain and Italy are the main cases I'm interested in here, but we can make, of course, very powerfully the same argument for Greece and for Portugal, and of course the many Central and Eastern European countries as well, even though most remain outside the Euro. You get this tension between the needs of convincing financial markets of your commitment to fiscal probity, whilst at the same time having to respond with very few resources available to the demands of a distressed population for social support from the state. So what you would expect, and what Polanyi would have predicted in this scenario, is exactly a counter movement, political movements which rise up demanding the reinstatement of protective institutions that have been put under threat by these fiscal constraints, and even, demands to introduce new protective institutions. It's true that for Southern Europe, like in most of Europe and especially Western Europe over the last 30, 40 years, what we really see is a constant pressure to roll back some of the protections, social protections, in the form of labor market regulations, in the form of trade unions, in the form of welfare policies, which have provided protection from market forces. And that kind of reached its high point, I guess, in the 70s and 80s in a lot of countries. And ever since, the sort of logic of European integration, as well as the logic of political economies in a global context more broadly, has been to push back, to reduce, to contain the growth of social spending, and to allow markets to operate with fewer and fewer restrictions. So the counter movement is all about these various social forces demanding something to be done to protect them from market downsides. Now, what's really interesting about Southern Europe, and I don't want to make big predictions about how this will turn out, but what has been, I think, fascinating about the last decade is to witness how, on the one hand, there's been considerable political disruption, which I will describe later on in the talk, but also broad support for remaining inside the institutions of not only the European Union, but also the institutions of European Monetary Union. In fact, as a British scholar, but who has worked on Southern Europe, it's always going to be a big paradox for me that the country who has decided to leave these institutions, Britain, is the country which was probably least constrained by them. I suppose that is in part possibly the explanation, because exit was easier for Britain than it would be for Greece or for Italy. But you know, the really, I guess, takeaway after 12 years now, 13 years nearly, of financial crisis and recovery, the big takeaway is, yes, these countries have suffered, there has been a counter movement, but this counter movement has not really pushed very hard to actually dismantle the institutions which constrain the government in Southern Europe. It does, however, pose a broader question of how and why different parts of the population mobilize to demand protection from market forces. And what's really interesting, what I try to do in the book and what I'm going to try to do in future research, is to try and understand why it is that economic shocks produce diverse political reactions, why some groups mobilize very intensely to protect their interests and other groups much less so, and why and how we can explain differences in cross-country patterns in this. So the Southern European example is, of course, very different from the other examples I look at in the book, Britain and America, which are, you know, as you all know, very advanced neoliberal economies in which the welfare state has been trimmed. It was never enormous in the first place, and it has been further reduced. Market forces have been allowed to operate very freely in financial, product, and even labor markets. The role of protective institutions like trade unions, which was never as strong as in countries in continental or Northern Europe, has been reduced still further. So this is a very distinctive kind of political economy, and it's the one probably a lot of the academic literature focuses on too. Southern Europe is, of course, much less studied, and it's interesting to see how the starting point for this counter movement is a very different one, which is that actually Southern European capitalism has long been very deeply embedded in social, political, and cultural institutions which constrain the market. So first of all, we have the role of religion, of course. Britain and America are different in this regard. America, despite being very religious in terms of individual practice, politically, religion has had little effect on the development of welfare institutions. In Britain, a very secular society, the same can be said too. There is no real remaining religious imprint in the British welfare state, although in the origins of the welfare state, of course, religion plays an important role everywhere. But in Southern Europe, you have this strong Catholic Orthodox culture, which feeds into policy choices, which feeds into institutional development. And I identify this influence as being partly the institutionalization of a suspicion of markets and a suspicion of individualism, which are, of course, individualism is the key underlying cultural logic of a market economy. And yet in Southern Europe, we still see, despite much change, much political, much social liberalization, if you like, there is still a strong familial, strong particularistic kind of pattern to welfare politics in large parts of the European political economy. So this means that the kind of arm's length exchange typical of liberal markets, the ideal of the self-regulating market economy that Polanyi described, is very difficult to achieve in a culture with relatively low social trust and a strong emphasis on personal ties. So this means that actually in the sort of post-war period, in the post-war boom period, when the welfare state was being constructed all around the advanced countries, in Southern Europe, the way in which the welfare state developed was very often influenced by these kind of familialistic and particularistic cultural traits, which meant that the welfare state also developed often in a very clientelistic fashion. And there was a high level of political corruption also, which ended up distorting market outcomes. Of course, the distortion of market outcomes is not necessarily a bad thing. Very often this clientelistic politics, which Italy was a great exemplar of in the post-war period, was very successful in shielding parts of society from market forces, very successful in redistributing resources from more successful regions or more successful social groups in economic terms to others. So what is really curious about, especially the Italian case, but also to some degree the others, is that the push towards an increasing judicialization of politics to try and reduce the role of political corruption, try to reduce particularistic patterns of political, of economic redistribution, have ended up actually exposing the population much more to market forces and creating more inequality and insecurity. Another key element of the Southern European model, which I think makes it distinctive compared to the other sort of Western European and Anglo-Saxon types, is the entrenched role of the state, the way in which the state has been unapologetically used as a way of regulating the market, rather than through the more kind of corporatist social partnership model that you see in continental Europe and Scandinavia. So lots of formalization of social protections, lots of micro regulation of economic relations, which has the effect of creating quite a rigid form of government control over the economy, which of course enables some of these corrupt relations that I described in the last slide. And there's the fascist legacy, which has affected Southern European countries in different ways, has been part of the reason why you get this particular statist model, although in many ways it's also partly due to the inspiration of the French legal and administrative model, which was used as a template by liberal reformers in the 19th and early 20th century, and certainly in Italy and Spain. So one of the outcomes of this then is you get a very sort of intrusive legal model of market regulation, which is not necessarily successfully executed as in the French case. Micro-regulation of markets, a large part of state control of production, at least in the post-war period. There has been a dismantling of this, of course, in recent years, and welfare systems often used as a tool of political mobilization and control. So here's some data on this. At the start point of European Monetary Union, you can see that this is some work I did with Mark Blythe. We put together an index of different forms of market regulation using data from the OECD and various other sources. And what you can see there is that the Southern European countries have significantly more intrusive patterns of market regulation than not only the Anglo-Saxon countries, as you would expect, but also continental and Northern European political economies too. So the background to this, of course, is that there is a particular pattern of party politics, which is typical across Southern Europe as well, the weakness of social democracy until relatively recently, and the historical strength of communism and anarchism creates a sort of very polarized type of politics in the 20th century. Conversely, the weakness of political liberalism and the strength of authoritarian attitudes amongst conservative elites, and the fascist experience, of course, which varies across the countries, obviously strong in Italy, more kind of conservative authoritarianism in Portugal and Spain, and to some extent Greece. You end up with a very polarized kind of political cleavages, which make creating the kind of social democratic welfare state characteristic of much of Western Europe very, very difficult. And what all of the kind of hegemonic political ideologies in Southern Europe across the 20th century, the ones that command most popular support, are very hostile to liberalism, and they're hostile to free markets. So there's very little sort of social support for the self-regulating market. So by joining the European project, of course, Italy was in from the start, Spain, Greece, and Portugal joined later, but they're effectively joining not only a political union which entrenches democracy, which entrenches sort of social and cultural liberalism too, but it also entrenches economic liberalism in particular. And the main the main institutions of the European Union, the single market, and now the monetary union are all sort of part of this project of entrenching the self-regulating market with this kind of ordo-liberal inspiration. So you see, Maastricht eliminates monetary policy powers and capital controls. So these are the statism characteristic of the 20th century Southern European model is obviously seriously undermined by this. Fiscal constraints, of course, challenge the welfare clientelism that I was describing before, and the single European market, and later the Lisbon strategy, and then the conditionality agenda after the financial crisis promotes deregulation, so regulatory disembedding, removing regulations which are seen as inconsistent with the market economy, but which act to provide social protection. And this, of course, accelerates when these countries require financial assistance after the financial crisis and during the European debt crisis. So what ends up happening is that you see consistent liberalization through the first decade of the Eurozone in Southern Europe. So this is a chart which draws on a slightly different data to the one I illustrated before, but captures something very similar, which is the degree of product market regulatory liberalism, if you like. High figures indicate a relatively protective type of product market regulation. In other words, lots of ways in which potentially different producer groups can be protected from market competition. The lower scores represent a more liberal market approach to product market regulations. Fewer controls, fewer institutions that might undermine open competition. And you can see that in all of the countries here, I've put Southern Europe alongside Germany, in all of the countries here, we get a decline in product market regulation over this, the first Euro decade, but it's very, very steep, especially in Italy, Portugal, and Spain, steeper than in Germany, in fact. Greece, a little bit of a laggard, but also significantly reduces its product market regulation. So what we're seeing here is this, a kind of Polanyian disembedding. The market is being superimposed on other structures which were served purposes of social protection, and of course, not just social protection. I don't want to idealize some of these regulations. Very often they take the form of protecting monopoly interests. They take the form of protecting inefficient forms of production from competition, allowing rent seeking, and so on. So I don't want to idealize the pre-Maastricht Southern European model, but of course the market liberalization inherent in the single market and in European monetary union is a threat to these established structures of controlling the economy, but also then a threat to the supporting coalitions of establishment political parties. So what you're doing here is creating an economy which is more exposed to market forces, and you're also undermining the power of the main establishment political representation. So this is made easier, of course, by the fact that the first decade of the Eurozone was a boom time for many of these countries, which allowed in some cases, especially Greece and Spain, and Portugal to some extent as well, an expansion of redistributive spending, which actually eased some of the social inequalities inherent in a market economy. So even before the crash of 2008, there were sort of signs that Southern Europe was developing counter-movement mobilization, because there are problems of implementation of some of these market reforms. It is quite often, the European Union can send out a directive, but to actually implement that on the ground and to make it work in the way intended, of course, is the preserve of the nation state institutions. And very often under the surface, you could see that the application of certain types of market reforms was honored more in the breach. So informal patterns of protectionism could survive even when the formal regulations had been liberalized along the lines established by the Single European Act. So regulatory changes could often be fudged or manipulated. Privatizations, very extensive privatizations in Italy and Spain. Italy had, I think, the biggest program of privatizations anywhere in the world in the late 1990s. These privatizations did not necessarily simply create open markets with competitive firms. It very often reconstituted political relationships and eased the way to new forms of corruption, which could enable powerful producer groups to continue enjoying privileged market positions. However, after the crisis of 2007-2008, these arrangements start to creak under the weight of the fiscal adjustment that's necessary, the lack of any macroeconomic policy autonomy, which means that the only possible adjustment mechanism after the crisis is what euphemistically is called internal devaluation. In other words, high levels of unemployment and generally wage freezes or even wage cuts. So this leads to the kind of disruption you would expect. The depth of the crisis is very serious, unemployment is very high, wages are falling, or at the very least frozen. And how are societies going to react to this? What are they going to demand? And the interesting conclusion that we can draw after a decade really is that to a significant extent, it has been domestic institutions rather than European institutions that have been scapegoated for the consequences of this, what I would describe as an inappropriate design of the monetary union. So dominant coalitions in the South actually largely accepted the Northern European or official EU diagnosis of the crisis, which that it was fueled by fiscal laxity, that countries in the Eurozone periphery had not reformed when the sun was shining, and so on and so on. So, you get this, the post-crisis austerity, of course, leads to political opposition, but it is not it is not a Eurosceptic opposition like the kind you see in Britain, which is ironic given that Britain was in some ways the least affected by European institutions in the way the crisis played out. But what you do see is a growth of anti-system political forces or non-mainstream political forces and decline in support for the European Union. And of course, other destabilizing phenomena like the threat of Catalan secession in Spain. So how do I fit this into a kind of broad explanation of what's happening in the Eurozone? In the book, I'm going to only present this in a fairly simplified fashion. But in the book, I go into a lot more detail. And I kind of articulate an interpretation of the North-South divide within monetary union, which is based on an interpretation of kind of fundamental differences between the ways in which the welfare states and labor market institutions insulate groups differently from economic shocks. And this is obviously a huge oversimplification, and there are many nuances that are missed in this binary presentation. But broadly speaking, the welfare states of Northern Europe, much more generous, much more universalistic, much more protective. But recent reforms have left certain groups, especially less educated groups, worse off than in the past, which fuels a particular kind of political reaction. But Southern European welfare states have a very different pattern of redistribution, very dualistic to a much greater extent than Northern Europe, and which leads to some insider-outsider dynamics in which older citizens are generally quite well protected against market downturns, younger outsider groups much more exposed. And because education is inversely correlated to age, this means that older insider groups are less likely to be highly educated, younger groups are more likely to be highly educated, and this has implications for the kind of political movements that they're going to end up supporting. And my broad conclusion from this is that in the North-South divide in the Eurozone, the creditor countries of Northern Europe tend to go politically to the right, whereas the debtor countries tend to go to the left. The Anglo-Saxon countries have both left and right wing forms of anti-system politics. So this is the argument in a sort of schematic form. So what we have really here is that, and we can ignore the last column because I'm not really going to talk about the UK and the US here, but in the Eurozone, the distinction between creditor and debtor countries is that creditor countries have both a stronger welfare state, which means that they come into the crisis with lower inequality, but also being countries that have run consistent trade surpluses, they are less affected by the crisis. They do not require a big suppression of domestic consumption to get through the crisis. And as a result of that, the political establishment manages to largely keep its grip on power. We'll see in the German elections this year. It may turn out a bit different this time, but the center is held in these countries for the most part, even in France, although France is in many ways the country most at risk of this group. And the main anti-system consequence of the crisis has been the rise of the anti-system right. And this is kind of well documented, and I won't talk about this in any length. But when we come to the debtor countries, and I'm focusing here on the dualistic welfare state type, which is characteristic of Southern Europe, we have the problem that you're coming into the crisis with already higher levels of inequality, precisely because the welfare state is very divisive in the way it protects groups differently. But you also have a more severe crisis because these countries are running significant trade deficits and are therefore forced to suppress domestic consumption a lot after the crisis because of financing problems. And this means that you have a severe crisis, high inequality, and the people most affected by the crisis tend to be younger voters, and younger voters for a variety of reasons, because they're more likely to be unemployed and need state support, but also because they're more likely to be sympathetic to socially liberal attitudes and less likely to scapegoat foreigners and immigrants for their problems. They're more likely to vote for the anti-system left. And this is why in the first phase of the Eurozone backlash, you get a strong rise of left anti-system groups, such as Podemos in Spain, Syriza in Greece, and the Five Stars movement in Italy, although we have also more recently seen the rise of right-wing anti-system parties too. So one of the consequences of this is that you get a sort of quite distinctive pattern of anti-system voting in the creditor countries of Northern Europe and the debtor countries of Southern Europe. So this is a chart that I call the crocodile chart. What this chart does is it shows the share of the vote for anti-system parties of the left and of the right in the creditor countries of Northern Europe, countries with trade surpluses, and the debtor countries, largely Southern Europe, also Ireland. And what you can actually see is that the creditor countries see a substantial rise in support for the anti-system right, although it is more gradual and it's already picking up before the big financial crisis, but very little progress for the anti-system left. That would be the orange line there, which is more or less flat. On the other hand, in the debtor countries, mainly Southern Europe, what we see is actually a dramatic increase in anti-system left voting after 2010, 2011. That's the red line that shoots up. But again, the anti-system right parties, on average, far less successful. So slight increase, but not so dramatic. I have to say that updating for the last 2 years would slightly change this picture, but not completely change the story, which is that the north goes right and the south goes left, essentially. Okay, how am I doing for time? Can I just check?
You should be slowly but certainly going towards the end.
Great, excellent. So I had a few charts from the specific cases of Spain and Italy, but I'm going to skip those and save them for Q&A if anyone's interested to talk about them more. So I'm just going to skip to my conclusion because we can talk about these other. These are just bits of supporting data from the individual cases, so I can talk about them more in the Q&A if you prefer. But yeah, let's get to the conclusion, because you've had a long couple of days, and I'm looking forward to hearing some questions. So what is my conclusion? Well, so far we can say it's a failed transformation, at least in the sense that if the objective of Eurozone institutional designers was to create a kind of ordo-liberal market economy, then we could say that to some extent it has failed, because Southern Europe has retained a distinctive variety of capitalism, and also it has seen significant political reactions against attempts to subvert that variety of capitalism. Now, of course, I'm calling it a variety of capitalism here. Hall and Soskis don't actually define Southern Europe as being, which I'm not sure I'm entirely convinced of, but this is something we can talk about later. But the broader question that I think the experience of Southern Europe tells us about European integration more broadly is, this poses the old question that Barry Eichengreen asked in both his earlier work on the gold standard and his subsequent work on the Eurozone, which is, well, can you enforce, can you actually apply the strictures, the rigor of an ordo-liberal, free, highly competitive market economy with very constrained fiscal and monetary policies, without some kind of radical political response that could potentially undermine democracy. And let's remember here that in the end, we're talking about Spain, Greece, and Portugal have been democracies since the late 1970s. This is not old democracy. I still believe they're relatively consolidated democracies, and I'm not expecting democracy to collapse in Southern Europe. In fact, in some ways, I feel democracy is more at threat in Britain and the United States than it is in Southern Europe. But it is true that what the European Union has done both in designing the Eurozone in such a way, which we can talk about in Q&A if you like, made the kind of debt crisis that occurred inevitable, but also by imposing this particularly harsh adjustment after the debt crisis, has really tested Southern European democracy far more than perhaps would have been wise. So predictably, we've had this kind of anti-market response. The double movement that Polanyi outlines plays out exactly, perhaps. Of course, Polanyi has no longer been with us for many decades, but would he have been surprised by what has happened? Possibly only would have been surprised by the fact that democracy has held, at least in Southern Europe. And most of Western Europe, of course, there are threats to democracy in many parts of Central and Eastern Europe, and in the United States, of course, too, but that's outside the Eurozone. So, is democracy at threat from this sort of clumsy attempt to impose market liberalism in a uniform way across rather diverse societies? Well, in some cases, clearly yes, but I'm not expecting Southern Europe to turn to authoritarianism, but there are very worrying signs of political polarization, especially in Spain, which suggests that there is a strong political cost to imposing policies in this way, especially when they leave people very vulnerable to market forces. So what the EU has ended up doing, of course, in the last few years is steadily softening this fiscal and monetary straitjacket, and of course, in the aftermath of COVID, has now launched a recovery fund. And I have no crystal ball, so I have no idea whether this will be enough to actually change the dynamic of politics. I suspect we'll be living with the consequences of the debt crisis still for quite some time. But ultimately, what we see is that it has been much more difficult than many European idealists might have expected to unite Europe around the idea of a free market economy without the other kinds of supportive political and cultural sources of unity that would have made this more sustainable. And I think I'll stop there and just look forward to hearing your questions, and any specific questions about the individual cases, of course, I'd also be be happy to take. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan Hopkin, for your presentation. I will now give the floor to Dr. Attila Meleg for an intervention, for a brief intervention.
First of all, thank you very much for this excellent talk. Very important arguments, which I think includes very important and very difficult points, which we need to think about. So the first thing I would like to talk a little bit about this issue of the Polanyi thesis. Because Polanyi, as in many of his writings, is extremely eloquent, but at the same time remains on a rather general level, which I think is, of course, an advantage from one point of view, but it's also a disadvantage. So, for instance, this statement, which I like, my favorite one concerning market utopia and counter movement, is what he said about Eastern Europe. In 1945, in this very good piece called Regional Planning or Universal Capitalism, he said very clearly, in case you let free market into Eastern Europe, you are going to get crazy nationalism. Well, Eastern Europe has done its job to prove Karl Polanyi perfectly. We have done the market utopia, plus we have done crazy nationalisms, right? That's, I think, it's beautiful. But the problem is, and then this is why I extremely enjoyed this talk and reading also other texts related to this, that we need to have a better sociology, a political sociology of concrete forms and dynamics of these double movements or counter movements, and how it is related to the marketization and how actually marketization goes on, which is also something to be taken into account. I am extremely, how to say, excited to see that, and this is also, I agree with this, and myself is also thinking in this direction, that one of the solution is this varieties of capitalism approach, which is going into some very important past dependencies in various ways. And then these trajectories and the interactions with the overall marketization process and the interaction with these trajectories, both on an ideological level and on a material level as well, is something to be worked on. So I think with this, basically, we are setting an agenda for a large number of researchers to do this job and to continue the work in various ways. What I found very interesting is, of course, the issue of welfare systems, which is a very Polanyian thing, how this has been developing and what interactions has been going on. Also very important social and cultural history as well. But the big thing today, what we were listening to today, was this creditor-debtor situation, which can be a kind of a switch in various ways. And I think it's a very important structural thing. Now, here comes, nonetheless, my first question. How does Eastern Europe come into this picture? Because Eastern Europe is it's like Southern Europe. It's very much involved in a massive unequal exchange with other parts of Europe and the key economies. Nonetheless, it is not showing the Southern European pattern. It is going massively toward the right wing. So there is something that we have to combine here. So that would be the first question I have. The second question is actually, once again, related to this issue of Polanyi, that double movement and counter movement. What type of double movement and what type of counter movement are we seeing? And here I would like to link this to a very much outdated concept, but which I find, I think, more interesting than most people think, namely the badly misunderstood problem of false consciousness. Because it has been misinterpreted in a lot of ways, but in case, my favorite is going back to some solutions of Lukács concerning this. False consciousness is not false in its that it is not detecting real experiences, and then it is not channeling such anxieties which are related to. That's not the point of Polanyi. Sorry, and it is also not. It is also not the point of Lukács to question this reaction. But he makes a very important point, which I think for all of us is super important. He argues that false consciousness has two very important characteristics. One is that it is not targeting the key contradictions of the current situation, and it is actually not showing a way out of the contradictions. The second point is that we need to get into historical dynamics. That is to say that we have to be able, as people doing the analysis, to get to the key currents of history. And then so my question is a very difficult one, of course, concerning this. And it is the following, that in case you look at, or we look at this map of counter movements, which are the most promising one in terms of historical dynamics and reacting to some key contradictions. That I think is important for us who are thinking not just in pure analytics. And of course, I have a great problem as well, because generally we explain the neoliberal period as being hijacked by a very arrogant elite, which has imposing us all kinds of things, like, including the euro, which anybody who studied finance could have said that euro in an unequal region is going to create enormous problems. This is, the second lesson in financial economics, what you can learn. Nonetheless, it was imposed. Beyond that, nonetheless, I think we social scientists, we also need to look at let me put it this way, but not in a nasty way, the complicity of society. What are the key things why we are also promoting marketization? We are not just the victims of this, but in some ways, sometimes we are trapped in certain situations. For instance, just in brackets, in the care of the elderly. This problem of, the decline of familiar systems of care, and then the promotion of, state intervention, then comes the neoliberal period, then we are all trapped and we are all pushing toward the marketized system of care. We are commodifying this on ourselves as well. So it's something important. But nonetheless, I think it's also important in terms of understanding the historical dynamics. So basically, I have these three questions. What is, how Eastern Europe comes into this picture, especially to the creditor-debtor and inequality system. Then the issue of how we can evaluate the various counter movements. And the third one, what kind of social processes and trends we see, which also maintains this marketization, which has already led to so many different problems. But otherwise, congratulations, a brilliant talk. And I think we should sit here for a couple of hours to continue this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Attila Mele, for your intervention and for your questions. And I would actually, for once in my life, want to use this position that I have to ask you also first question, and then after you reply, I will open the discussion. My question is, how does it enter in your model, the fact that these southern countries that you're talking about, and I'm talking mostly about Italy because I'm not such a, I'm not so knowledgeable about the Spanish history, but I am about the Italian one, the internal divide. And when I'm asking that is basically we speak of Italy, but actually we speak of more than one Italy's, even in times of capitalist varieties or varieties of capitalism. And I'm asking these questions because according to the regions we are looking at, anti-system means different things. And for example, like one of the, at least now, when I'm thinking at Movimento 5 Stelle, for example, Movimento 5 Stelle actually didn't catch so well in the southern parts, if you think of that. More or less, they're historically parties that are really anchored, you know, have a historical relevance, tend to win. That would be one aspect of the problem. And second, how do you take into consideration grassroots movement and political movements very on the left that originate exactly there from the problems that arise? And basically their demands is not for, I don't know, anti-system, it's actually more politics, more state, as they perceive the state as being completely withdrawn. Again, I don't know that much about the Spanish situation, and I don't want to speculate on that, but as far as I know, the same problems in a way are also there. And then I'm asking you, for example, if we think at the southern varieties, a southern variant of capitalism, maybe the thing that actually captures one of its key ingredients is exactly this structural dualism. And how does this play into your discussion? I'm sorry to have taken the time and asked this first question. Until Professor Hopkin replies, please all think about questions, and if you can raise your hands, then like this I can make a list, or if you want, you can write in the chat. Thank you again for your presentation, and thank you for your kindness to answer them.
Thanks both. Those are really great comments and questions. So yeah, I mean, I would. I wish I knew a lot more about Central and Eastern Europe, I have to say. How does it come into the picture? I mean, one of the ways it comes into the picture, of course, is that you know, most of Central and Eastern Europe is outside the Eurozone and therefore not directly subject to the kinds of financial constraints that Eurozone members are, and this makes quite a big difference. But I think the reason, so I mean, ultimately, I mean, a lot of the argument I'm trying to make here is not only inspired by Polanyi, but inspired by also another Polanyi scholar, really, which is Sherry Berman, whose great work on the German and Swedish responses to the Great Depression, why one opted for National Socialism and the other for social democracy. It's been a huge inspiration for my attempt to understand what's going on in Southern Europe. And what Sherry argues is that, you know, you, in the end, ultimately, you can, the same shock can provoke completely different interpretations and therefore completely different kinds of political movements to react to the shock. So why is it that Central and Eastern Europe has tended to shift to the right rather than the left? I can only speculate, knowing very little about the region. One likely explanation is the historical experience of the worst kinds of left-wing politics, we could probably say, right? The experience of communism and the identification of socialism with dictatorship and lack of freedom, and also for many, I guess, lack of economic progress too, could well have closed off a left-wing route out of the crisis potentially. This is as a comparativist rather than as someone who knows anything much about Central and Eastern Europe, that immediately springs to mind, whereas a common explanation for the more popular left-wing response in Southern Europe has been precisely the opposite, especially in Spain and Greece and Portugal, where very recent experiences of right-wing dictatorship could have performed exactly the same kind of function. However, I think that's maybe too simple. And I think, you know, in a way, actually, my answer is to revert to your second question, which is that we, you know, and confess that I think we need to learn a lot more. I mean, I've been trying to do this. Part of what the objective of my research is to try to understand better why a common set of problems can produce a bifurcation of different kinds of responses. And I think the way you frame it in terms of different forms of false consciousness is very, very interesting, because precisely what are the blind spots that societies or different groups within societies have? So for instance, I said I wouldn't talk about Brexit, but here I am immediately. What occurs to me is that Britain is a country which has, I think, largely benefited hugely from European integration without having to face most of the worst costs of it. So I think to leave was a really crazy idea, when we were clearly, the cost benefit analysis for me was very positive, but for many people, freedom of movement of people in particular, so mass immigration from the rest of Europe, especially after the crisis, led to a very easy response that you feel poor and you see lots of more foreign people around, and so the reason is the foreign people must be taking what you're entitled to. And this is a very typical reaction in financial crises, right? And we saw it in the 30s too. And I think understanding better, I think Sherry Berman's work does a lot along these lines to try and understand better why particular groups might go in different directions. But what I've tried to do with the kind of welfare state framing of the analysis of the counter movements is to try and understand why it is that the way the shock filters through to different people in different ways, and the ways in which the predispositions perhaps of different groups already orient them towards a different kind of response, could explain why we get a right-wing response in one place and a left-wing response in another, or indeed, different forms of nationalism too, because as well as the right-wing nationalism we see in places like Hungary, or even in Brexit, I think considerably is along these lines too, we also have nationalisms like in Scotland and Catalonia, which are taking a much more progressive, even more left-wing stance, but they are still nationalisms. And I think it's incredibly fascinating to think about why it is that nationalism can itself go in these two different routes, which I think offers a bit of an answer to Dana's question as well. So what kinds of internal divides and what kind of path dependencies shape the response, I think is a big part of this. I don't think there is an abstract model you could use to explain perfectly well why one country would go one way and another would go a different way, because you need to understand the historical legacies which shape the way people view particular kinds of social conflicts. I mean, my underlying approach to this is that these social conflicts take very similar forms in all of the countries that have been affected by financial crisis in a similar way. But then, the institutions and histories of these countries may push them down different paths. It's a classic path dependency kind of argument. I mean, the final point that Attila asked about, why we end up embracing marketization when it damages us is a fascinating one, which I have no real deep answer to, but except to think that I think there's always a temptation, and I think one of the reasons why perhaps the ultimate outcome of a decade of counter movement and anti-system politics in response to the crisis is not much change. And I think part of the reason for that is that we have been seduced by the promise of the market utopia, that the market utopia is always appealing, that we would all love to think that if we just mind our own business, society would be better. And I think that is always, just as fascism is always a danger, I think also the kind of libertarian laissez-faire reaction to social problems is always a danger too. Both are excessively simplistic, both are dangerous in completely different ways. But in the end, I think we all want to mind our own business, but also be looked after. And I think that is a fundamental human contradiction which drives the difficulty in resolving these problems. But thank you for the comments and questions. They were really made me think.
Thank you also, Jonathan, for your responses. We already have some questions. Valentina was first.